All right, good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce Mitchell Stevens, who is an associate professor of education at the Graduate School of Education here at Stanford, as well as an associate professor by courtesy of organizational behavior and sociology. And he's also currently the director of the Center for Advanced Research through Online Learning. And Mitchell describes himself as an organizational sociologist with long-standing interests in the quantification of educational processes, alternative educational forms, and formal organization of knowledge. And he applies these interests to his research foci, of which there are many, but the three most appropriate for our discussions here today are academic restructuring, change in higher education, and globalization. And we invited Mitchell here today to talk about his latest book, Seeing the World, How U.S. Universities Make Knowledge in a Global Era. And I have to say these are also available for sale out in the lobby if you're interested. And while I was reading Mitchell's book, I have to say that I had to catch myself from looking over my shoulder on occasion, because I do feel like Mitchell has spent the last several years spying on my professional life as I work in area studies. And the book is a really great description about how universities see, teach, produce knowledge about the world and all of the structural challenges that we as educators face. So please join me in welcoming Professor Mitchell Stevens.
Thank you, Kate. It's nice to be here. Nice to see several of you again. I met several from the EPIC planning group a few weeks ago, and so I hope I don't wear out my welcome. I'll try to make some rather different contributions than I did at that. It truly is an honor to have this opportunity for several reasons. One is my colleagues and I wrote this book for you. For our colleagues across the U.S. academic world who care about teaching and research of phenomena beyond U.S. borders. It's also another part of the honor is that I was at Stanford in 2010 when the idea for this program germinated in what is now the Global Studies group, and to see it flourish is really quite heartening. I spent just a few minutes in the session that convened over here on globalizing curriculum outside of the classroom, and I was struck once again by just how much civil society in the United States is conveyed on the campuses of colleges and universities in general, and in California, on the campuses of community colleges in particular. How much less public discourse would we have in this state if it weren't for the 114 community colleges that are embedded in the fabric of essentially every community in the state? What you do is very important, and it's an honor to serve you and also to participate in a cross-institutional community. We only need more of that these days. I've been trying to figure out what a university is for about 15 years now. On my view, not that I would wish social science on anything, but colleges and universities, on my view, don't have the social science that they deserve. Imagine, if you could, what the history of the United States would look like if we didn't have Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Michigan, Stanford, Texas, Virginia, North Carolina, and in the second half of the 20th century, the comprehensive universities and community colleges that made college a realizable goal for the majority of American citizens. There is no nation state without universities. There is no nation state without universities. But universities are not mere units of government, especially in the United States. We exist alongside and at the interstices of government and civil society. Sometimes sometimes Stanford feels like a vestibule of Washington, D.C. Sometimes it feels like a like a philanthropic recipient of Washington. At many times in its history, it's been an agent of Washington and its geopolitical ambitions worldwide. But they're peculiar institutions. They partake of public and private government and civil society and market logics kind of all at the same time. We produce neurophysicists and sociologists and water polo players every day simultaneously. And I often think also like another counterfactual, if a university was like a Jenga game, like how many pieces of a university could you take away until it was no longer a university? What pieces are essential? What happens if I take football out? Does the whole apparatus collapse? And so I've been working on that question with many people across the country, primarily sociologists and historians. Strangely, there is almost no political science of higher education, disciplinary political science of higher education. So it's an interesting puzzle. And what I want to focus on today is a portion of the book that Kate mentioned. I want to talk about 3 modal ways in which U.S. universities have organized research and teaching on the rest of the world. I want to talk about colleges and universities as cumulative organizations. And I want to talk about the primacy of academic departments in intramural academic status systems, which sounds a little sociologese, but I promise it won't for very long. And I want to give you a sense but first I want to give you a sense of kind of where this book came from. The initial motivation for the project that became Seeing the World was essentially a question of why there is so little disciplinary social science, and I specifically mean economics. I'm referring specifically to the nomothetic social sciences, the ones that have the hubris of claiming to produce universalizable, generalizable knowledge, economics, political science, and sociology. Why is there so little disciplinary social science on regions outside of the United States and the countries bordering the northern Atlantic Ocean? And why is that the case? And if I'm just going to, what do I want to say? I'm not going to show you evidence for that fact, but we'll just take it as given for today. But I'm happy to provide some if you like. Why has there been so little economics, political science, and sociology on the rest of the world in the United States? Despite decades of voluminous critique, and if you're like me, you cut your intellectual teeth on at least one of these books. The 1970s in particular sustained a very rich academic discourse about the sort of implicit imperialism, scientific or otherwise, that's kind of baked into North American social science. Also, the federal government, the Department of Education, the Ford Foundation, the Social Science Research Council, have dangled carrots in front of economists, political scientists, and social science. So here's the cover of my lovely book. The book is the product of about 10 years of work by 3 lead authors. There are many people involved in the project. My co-authors are Cynthia Miller-Idris, who is a student of right-wing extremism in German youth culture, contemporary Germany, and Setane Shami, who is an anthropologist who specializes in the Caucasus, who has overseen the Asia portfolio at the Social Science Research Council for many years. In the wake of, maybe see if this one, let's see if this one left too. This is the representation of an airplane flying into this second tower to go on September 11th, 2001. In the wake of the 9/11 tragedy, there was, as you certainly understand, considerable anxiety across sort of every knowledge-producing unit in Washington on why there was so little systematic social science on Islam and the Middle East and the larger Islamic world. Despite the fact that Title VI of the Higher Education Act had been systematically funding Middle Eastern studies for many decades, we'd gotten a lot of civilizational study, a lot of literary and historical analysis, a lot of archaeology, but not very much work on the 20th century Islamic world. And what do you know? Title VI to put out an RFP specifically charged with investigating the place of the social sciences in Middle Eastern studies funded by Title VI. And Setaneh Shami, and as many of you know, and I'll rehearse for you in a moment, the Social Science Research Council had been instrumental in creating the Area Studies form as we know it, and by virtue of that historical investment, the project that I'm reporting on today is actually the first empirical study that SSRC mounted on its own rather than farming out to other universities. So it was an effort of a kind of self-inquiry into what had happened to area studies and how the area studies project had and had not served academic understanding of the Middle East and the larger Islamic world. So that's the context in which the work came. Title VI, as you know, has brought us all into this room, essentially. It's an elemental part of the federal government's investment in academic infrastructure on international inquiry. And my colleague, Cynthia, took the lead on designing a study which essentially was a qualitative comparative analysis. The core empirical material are interviews with the academic chairs of economics, political science, and sociology at 8 U.S. research universities that have multiple Title VI funded centers on the Middle East and its neighboring geographies. So South Asia, Central Asia, Russian East Asia, on the logic that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the ongoing question about where the Middle East stops and Europe and Asia begins became sort of newly vital questions. So the sampling frame was 8 research universities that had multiple Title VI funded. Can you hear me if I'm not doing that? Okay. That had multiple Title VI funded centers of contiguous geographies. Interviewed the departmental chairs, interviewed the chairs of the Title VI centers who may or may not have been social scientists. Also the associate directors, who, as we all know, do most of the work, who are often but not always PhD level academics themselves. And then at the campuses that had deans of global or international affairs, those folks as well. So the larger, I had a slide describing the project. Yeah, I guess it did. There it is. And then Cynthia had her second baby, and the project had amassed 10,000 pages of interview material. She's like, what do we do now? Can you help? I'm like, oh, sure, I guess I'll help with that. So I joined the project right after data collection, and the journey subsequently has been sort of thrilling but also humbling, because sort of coming to terms with the scale of the intellectual investment in the Area Studies project in the second half of the 20th century, and the plurality of humanistic and social science scholars who contributed to that. I had cut my teeth on some prior empirical studies of the formal organization of universities, but boy, nothing. This was a real learning experience and a terrific opportunity. So that's where I come from. I want to give you a sort of a thumbnail sketch of the Area Studies project, where it came from as a scientific and intellectual movement. That will be a rehearsal for some of you, I'm sure. And then I want to talk about what is on half of your handout there, which is. And I suspect if there's an actual historian in the room, you're more than welcome to throw a tomato at me. I'm going to give you a very schematic sociologist's conception of a very complicated history in an attempt to suggest that the colleges and universities that we inherit are essentially intellectual anarchies, and they've become, especially with regards to global phenomena, and they become only more complicated over time, intramurally, which has both smiley face and frowning face implications for those of us who seek to globalize the curriculum of our students. And then that's what I want to suggest. Why does thinking about academic history this way help us as educators? What is area studies? I want to suggest that it's three things: a scientific and intellectual movement, a controversial academic project, and most important for our purposes today, an enduring organizational form. Basically, I was using book covers as my citations. So there are books here that you might or might not recognize if you see the pictures, but that's what they mean. And this notion of scientific intellectual movement comes from colleagues of mine in sociology, Neil Gross and Scott Frickel. But what they basically say is, if academics or intellectuals want to get something going, the way in which they need to get something going is much akin to social movement mobilization in other sectors. What do you need if you want to develop a new line of inquiry? Well, you need human capital, you need real estate, you need a couple of file cabinets, you need a seed grant from your provost, you need physical space to convene, you need an intellectual rationale, you need a scope and sequence for where your intellectual project is trying to go, you need students, you need an audience. And a lot of academic work and I know that you guys know what I'm talking about, those of you who are putting together new programs on your campuses. You have to kind of assemble resources and then very persistently and stubbornly, pursue the creation of new entities on your campuses. What we suggest is that area studies itself was a very large, multi-decade social and intellectual movement, which came often flew under the banner of modernization theory. Some of the fanciest and most ambitious social scientists of their generation, Gabriel Allman, Talcott Parsons, Robert Hall, Walter Rostow, Emanuel Wallerstein, David Apter, built their careers around a notion that social science itself should address globally distributed phenomenon, and that it was in fact possible to build a social science about globally distributed phenomenon, that a coherent analytic could be built to make sense of the general process of modernization. It's kind of spectacularly ambitious, and in retrospect, in the wake of the crisis of representation, and the end of the Cold War, and other late 20th century revelations, seems almost humbling, spectacularly naive. But in any case, it was a very ambitious intellectual movement. And do I have the guy's picture? My favorite citation here is to Nils Gilman, who's an intellectual historian who now works at the Berggruen Institute in Los Angeles, in a book called Mandarins of the Future, which essentially describes the extent to which the intellectual and career ambitions of modernization theorists co-evolved with the US federal government's need to tell stories about a virtuous democratic capitalism in the post-colonial world, right? So in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, as you recall, American version of democratic capitalism was not the only utopia on order, and it was available to the decolonized world, and there was a great deal of uncertainty about just how democratic capitalism would fare relative to American-style democratic capitalism would fare relative to the socialist capitalist democracies of Western Europe and certainly the various communisms that were available to new states. And modernization theory was part of the intellectual armament of the US federal government's multiple branches' efforts to promulgate a certain version of a democratic and capitalist future. And it made a lot of careers of social scientists, and it made a lot of universities rich, frankly, including the one that we're in. So Stanford University became sort of a central player in federal government subsidized social science of influence across the world during these periods. And it's only now coming into full recognition that part of the reason the Cold War was so good for universities is that fighting wars requires immense mobilization, and we live in a country that is constitutionally allergic to growing government ministries. So there are these critters called universities that exist in literally every state in the U.S. Americans love them. They cheer them at football games. They send their sons and daughters to them. They've got a lot of smart people on them. And universities became enlisted in the project of U.S. geopolitical expansion in ways that fundamentally changed both universities and that fundamentally shaped both universities and federal government global policy during this period. So at area studies, this brilliant idea that social science could be strategically leveraged to help the United States make sense of parts of the world and strategically fateful phenomena in particular parts of the world was one of the mechanisms through which the State Department and the Department of Education cooperated with academics to enlist social science targeted on specific world regions. Drive-by history, I recognize, but sometimes it's useful. Schoolhouse Rock can be helpful sometimes. All right, and I hope to, again, recognize here that I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. So also, from the beginning, area studies was a controversial academic project, right? Not everyone agreed with this notion that social scientists should assist the United States in helping the world move faster toward a virtuous democratic modernity. This was controversial. A colleague of ours in New York describes the constitutive crisis of area studies, that from the moment of its inception, the enterprise was regarded as politically problematic. To what extent should academics be in the service of a certain kind of American empire? C. Wright Mills, the sociologist, was one of the most outspoken critics of federal patronage for social science of this sort. And then the part I want to leave you on is, and where we end with the second chapter of the book, is area studies was a social and intellectual movement implicated in the Cold War project of the United States. It was controversial from its beginning, and it's also an enduring organizational form. A central argument of the book is area studies as funded by Title VI of the Higher Education Act created a new organizational form that continues to inform how universities like this one are organized. These are entities called centers. They have lots of names. Institutes, projects, networks, programs, initiatives. This is the second side of your handout. All of these entities bear one thing in common. All of them are not departments. Okay, so these are units that, and we're in university land right now. And by university land, I mean post-secondary institutions that are primarily organized around the production of research and the production of doctoral students, right? And as you all know, departments that train PhDs are kind of the Brahmin caste of the academic status system, right? So a tenured or tenure line appointment in departments at the arts and sciences core is sort of the sine qua non of academic status. There are lots of other people and programs that populate universities that are not in departments, and those are the centers and networks and programs and initiatives, one of which Stanford Global Studies represents. And these things are sort of critical players in intramural academic ecologies, precisely because they're not departments. So if you have a center or an institute or a program or an initiative or a network on something, you can create new versions of these things anytime a new patron comes along, right? Or there's some new funding stream from government, or some number of the board of trustees thinks you really ought to be doing, more of this and less of that. So these entities are sort of flexible units that can grow in the direction of new forms of resources, and they can also be used as carrots to encourage faculty to do particular things or to retain them when they get an offer at Harvard. You can give them one of these centers with a budget on them and give them a website, an administrator, and some letterhead, and they're happy for a few more years. So they enable universities to very flexibly respond to changes in intellectual fashion and in funding streams. And they're much more easy to create than academic departments, because those are really expensive and they're really hard to close, right? No one likes to close a department. It's sort of, people are embarrassed when a department closes. And so what universities have done over the last 75 years is created this kind of binary structure in which academic departments have tenured faculty lines and dedicated graduate student training programs. And those things are pretty stable. And then they have this universe of not departments that surround these entities that are the flexible mechanisms through which universities adapt and change over time. And they're really important for raising money, because it turns out that most research university faculty, they just want to do stuff that will give them prestige among 100 other people, right? So it's like, it turns out economists just want to do economics, right? They're not really interested in India, right? So but if a patron wants investment in India, right? What a provost can do is create, an inter-school program on, the future of South Asia, right? And then and set that thing alongside the economics department, and then you kind of coax a few economists, right, with the various things that you can coax economists with, right, to sort of sit in that thing. And then when that patronage goes away, you just shrink that thing, right? So they provide this really important kind of buffer and swing space that are really useful to universities. The thing is, and we'll come back to this, they're great for academic planners, but what they do is they essentially create a binary hierarchy between faculty who have disciplinary appointments and everybody else. So we'll come back to that. So that's area studies, 3 things. All right, 10 more minutes. Okay. So here's another problem. We're going to switch gears for a second. We're going to do a jump cut here. So the idea of a university is a pretty arrogant claim, because a university says universities by definition comprise the whole of human knowledge, everything that's known. University, right? Well, how do you organize the whole of knowledge, right? I mean, it's kind of a management problem for provosts, right? There's no, you have to sort of turn the whole of knowledge into a kind of bureaucratic system, right? And the master template for that has been the academic department system, which coalesced in the 1890s, and we won't talk about that today. And that's really kind of hardwired into the DNA of virtually all universities now. But it turns out the world doesn't really fit into the abstractions of disciplinary departments, right? Economics, philosophy, education, sociology. Where do you put Africa, right? Africa, right? So, and that's been a sort of an enduring intellectual problem for university planners. And we suggest, writing heavily on secondary literature in a wide range of fields, that one way to sort of think about that how that problem's been solved over time is to think about 3, we call them schemata, a civilizational, a national service, and a global schemata. And schemata are, my friend Paul DiMaggio has given a nice definition there. But it's basically, when Kate and Giovanna invited me to come to this thing, said, we're doing a conference, and we'd like you to give a keynote. And I said, what's a conference? What's a keynote? No, I knew exactly what a conference was and a keynote was, right? Because everybody knows what a conference is, right? Everyone knows what a keynote is. The question is how many minutes? And is it the opening keynote or the closing keynote, right? And how many sessions will there be, right? Because we have in our head a scheme that tells us what a conference is, and that it's not a law that a conference has to have keynotes and breakout panels, but the fact that we all have sort of shared understanding of what a conference is enables lots of other collective action. That's what cognitive psychologists mean by schemas, essentially. They're sort of ways of sort of thinking about how the pieces of a puzzle fit together that enable collective action. And we suggest, I want to suggest that the world has been organized on US university campuses in light of three sort of general schemata. The first, and I won't talk about them at length here, I'll just give you examples of them. The first is what we call a civilizational schema, in which the rest of the world is like a universe of exotic others, and the job of a university is to bring pieces of those exotic others to particular places for the edification of particular people, like Iowans, right? Iowans can't travel the world, but the University of Iowa can bring pieces of the world and its intellectual riches to them, right? This is the university as a kind of museum or curio cabinet in which not only objects, but perhaps like linguistic or literary traditions are sort of housed and offered to the clients of a particular institution. The national service, and that obtained to the United States well into the middle of the 20th century. And then the area studies model that I talked about earlier is one exemplification of a national service schema in which the university is regarded as a kind of servant of Washington in its efforts to aggrandize and protect the status of the United States in the global political order, right? Harvard in the nation's service, right? There's a reason we're tax exempt. That's one of them, at least, right? On the logic that universities are servants of states. And that is the one that got built out in the and created the academic universe that that produced both you and I know that by virtue of your estimated lifespans. And then the third is a global schema, which is still it does not have a coherent narrative, which I find thrilling, right? The global narrative says a university is not just a servant of Washington. We serve global citizens. We produce global students. We're here for everyone. We're agnostic about national borders. We have students from all over the world, and we have patrons and clients from all over the world, and we're really agnostic about national borders. We think they get in the way of real clear understanding. But what's interesting to me at this moment is that there's no clear narrative line for how a university should be global. Everyone knows we should be more global than we are. We're never sure if we're global enough. And is there one way to be global or multiple? Should we do the NYU thing with multiple campuses or what? And Stanford just rolled out I was joking, it's the most human capital intensive PowerPoint slide deck I've ever seen. The president, after thousands of hours of campus-wide discussions, guess what? It's time for a new strategic plan. Meaning, one of the richest universities in the world needs to get even richer, so here's how we're going to try it. And on the global, basically, the president punted. He's like, we have to be more global. I'm going to have a president's committee to help me figure out how to be global. Next slide, right? Like, there's no narrative. It's just we have to have a bunch of stuff, and that's really important. And let's keep going. So we're all trying to be global, but there's no schematic consensus about how you know if you're global enough. Okay. So what does this mean for us? What that means, I would suggest in, oops, did that wrong. Here's the big point. The schemata are not replicative, right? One doesn't go away when the other one rises, right? And this, I think, is the general feature of universities that makes them exquisitely unlike virtually all other organizations. Other organizations pride themselves in shedding the past, letting go, reconfiguring, right? Like, just like our psychotherapists tell us to do, like get over the past, start anew. Universities, no. We don't throw away old stuff when we have new stuff. We hang on to the old stuff, and then we layer the new stuff on top and in between, so that universities become ever more complicated mechanisms for producing knowledge and teaching people over time, right? And I would suggest that is, with the global, that's what we inherit today. We inherit a world in which the civilizational, the national service, and the global are all kind of mixed in. I'll give you some examples of that. So here's just some data from the talk. I'm going to have Giovanna and Elizabeth read these for me. So Giovanna, you be the director, and Elizabeth, you be the associate. These are two people at Russia East Asia Centers in a large public university in the U.S. South.
In addition to the regular travel funds, we'll give them small amounts of money if they agree to pick up bits and pieces that we can use as part of our outreach travel trunks, our culture kits, bits of clothing, bits of souvenir-y type things that we put into our elementary and junior high outreach programs.
Talking about faculty who receive funds from the Title VI Center.
For the yard, we now have a yard on campus, and so we are getting cultural bits for the inside.
Right, we're trying to decorate. It's an American yurt, but it does have the right shape to it. We've been told by several students from Kyrgyzstan and all that we would be considered a very poor family given the size of the yurt. This is a very small yurt. It would be an extremely poor family, but we're at least trying to decorate it in the style of Central Asia. People just come through saying, what is this? What is this tent thing? And so we get flyers on what a yurt is, and the rugs are all authentic that we have inside. They're all from Central Asia.
So, it's easy to grin about this, but it's also the case that these folks were very adamant in their interview that, like, we bring Central Asia to South Texas. Like, that's what we do, right? And maybe the yurt's a little silly, but this idea that we bring experiences, right, bits of the world that wouldn't otherwise be in our students' lives, which we think harkens to the civilizational tradition. Kate, can you read this one? And this is a sort of trace of the national service schema, we argue.
Sure. There definitely is that sense coming from outside of the university that if the government is funding programs on Middle Eastern studies, then those programs should be producing people who are going to be actively working for the interest of the United States, however that's defined. I'll give you a very micro instance of the way that's affected some of the things I do, because as director of the master's program, I do put together these career workshops, and I do make more of a concerted effort now to get government agencies in to pitch careers to our students. So we had the FBI come last month. We have someone from the State Department come. We were trying to get someone from the CIA to come because as much, it's irrelevant whatever my personal opinions are of those kinds of careers. The fact is, if we have students who are interested in those kinds of careers, I want to enable them.
So still, this notion that we are servants of government. We train people who are in government or military service, and that's kind of, we're supposed to answer the phone when government agencies call. Very much woven into the Title VI landscape. And then, of course, but here comes globalization, the global schema. John, could you read this for me?
The universities talk a lot about globalization and an international university, but I'm not sure the university is in its own mind really knows where they want to go or what they want to do. They've created new offices, the Vice President for International Relations, and moved all the undergraduate international programs into an office of global programs, study abroad, things like that. Very little contact with us other than, you know, hi, I'm here, I'm you, let's have a little chat. And that's about the extent of our interaction with them. I'm not sure the university has thought about how we fit into what they view as the internationalization of the university.
Yeah. So here comes global. Global's a lot of things, and the area studies center people can't presume that they're the ones who are going to get the call every time, right? So we're at a moment now where the area studies legacy is just part of a kind of ongoing intramural competition for who's gonna be on that president's committee, essentially. And in the book we talk about we are convinced that this shift from a national service model to a global model is largely a function of the fact that the federal government is essentially no longer a reliable patron to U.S. universities. Okay. That ongoing omnibus, always more funding for education and research that came from Washington between 1945 and 1990 is over, right? And so US universities need to seek clients and patrons all over the world. And they know they need to still have fealty to the feds, but they can't just rely on the feds. And so on our view, the global discourse is imperative because universities must have transnational patrons to survive, but it's not clear what the most virtuous way of telling that story is, and how different kinds of clients should be adjudicated and evaluated one against each other. So a time of great turbulence and intellectual opportunity, but also a lot of uncertainty. All right, so what does this mean for those of us who care about globalizing curriculum? I want to suggest that that change, that secular change in the layering of ways of thinking about the global, is happening even while disciplinary departments maintain their intramural primacy. And I heard about this in one of your panels too. There's still economics, political science, philosophy, sociology, and they still control the academic senate, and they're still the most privileged parties on campus, and they're still the most obdurate organizational units. And so whatever we're trying to do in global land, we still have to sort of deal with the fact of this obdurate DNA organizational structure. Let me stop with, I have one more slide, okay? And this is where I think this leaves us, and then I'm just look forward to our conversation. I think what all this might mean for those of us who care about international inquiry, we're always going to have a place at the table. Because universities are obliged to be cosmopolitan places. We're not always very good at it, but we know we kind of have to be global. We're not allowed to not be. So on your campus and mine, it may feel like what we're up to is a struggle, but it's a struggle that there will always be a place for that struggle, because you essentially can't be an academic institution without claiming to have a global reach and ambition. The character of the place that you have at the table is always going to feel fragile and contingent. Like, you're always going to feel like you're fighting an uphill battle, because the university at its core is not organized around international issues. It's organized around disciplinary abstractions. So get comfortable with the struggle to negotiate global curriculum alongside the core of your institutions. And then finally, this discursive landscape does change over time. So how academics and intellectuals sort of think of themselves as carriers of global knowledge, and what we think our responsibilities are as educators to our students is dynamic. And in the process of doing the work that you're doing, literally on a daily basis, you are making up that narrative. And someone's got to do it, and it may as well be us. I'll stop there.
Any questions?
please. And if you could introduce yourself, ideally you would stand up and introduce yourself. That would be great. Thanks.
Pretty loud enough. Okay, so my name is Kathleen Feinberg. I'm an English instructor at Skyline College. And I was responding to the quote here. You said schema is cumulative, not replicative. And the universities do not shed. So I've been reading, I read a lot of the called Higher Education, and they talk a lot about the universities really needing to change their structure in order to meet the demands of the new world. And at the same time, you have a lot of more students going to college because now they have to go to college in order to exist. But the fact of the matter is that some elite students get really good jobs, which basically pay the college tuition, the loans, whereas a lot of other students graduate and cannot even pay their loans and never will be able to pay their loans. So I'm wondering, along with this, is there any kind of restructuring in the distance that is happening? That is, is that actually happening, or is this something that is only talked about? Because it seems like this is talked about, but how is this going to really be implemented in restructured?
I would swear affirmatively if I could, but I won't. Absolutely, we are in the. Who knows? I don't know. To say we're in the midst of an institutional restructuring would suggest that I know that we're halfway done, but I don't know that that's the case. We are in a. I'm so glad you raised that. On my view, the end of the Cold War, coupled with the property tax revolts, began here in California in the 1970s, precipitated into still ongoing change in who is presumed to be the proper funders of higher education. Whose foothill college is it? Right? Is it the state of California's? Is it Santa Clara counties? Is it the students who you actively recruit from Cupertino and Bangladesh? Right? Like, whose is that, and how should it be paid for? Are very open questions at this moment, and so that's sort of very much in the back. That's sort of animating this entire discussion, I would say, in my view. What's startling to me in this is that we essentially have no leadership from Washington at this moment in that whole process of fundamental restructuring. The current Department of Education sort of basically telling us each to work it out in our own various ways. So sort of how that overlaps with this notion of internationalism, the only thing I think I can say with some confidence is that I think the global discourse itself is a servant of this new financial picture in which, again, Foothill and Deanza are great examples where you're sort of actively seeking clients from all over the world. Another example, and maybe we live in a world now in which the University of Wisconsin and the University of Iowa are competing for the same affluent Chinese families. Right? That's never happened before. Right? So clearly that's a big part of the story. Yes.
I'm Scott Langford. I teach at Foothill College. I also teach English, and I got my degrees at Stanford, so I'm a little bit of a Stanford history buff on the side. So I wanted to first observe that you got me thinking that I think your three schemas sort of oddly correspond to the Stanford quad with the engineering corner and the history corner. The museums built by Mrs. Stanford down Palm Drive, being sort of a museum model, and then really where I started this question, when it was a question, was where does the Hoover Institute fit in? As both schematically and chronologically, it seems to me that it was, in fact, at least in my much more limited description of history of universities, it was sort of the first center, and the fact that it's founded by a former president of Stanford who's a president but then comes back because he loses the election and so on and so forth, and is still recognized as this quasi-independent institution with its own political agenda, its own funding, its own tower, its own everything. So I just wondered where that fits in to the schema that you're talking about, and it is deeply international and area studies like, right? And it's best its best side is that, right, that it does bring an intensity of concentration. That was its original intent, right? It was intended for that. So where does that all fit in?
Yeah. You know, I would suggest the Hoover Institution is a giant not department, right? It's a giant thing. It had an advocate and a patron, Herbert Hoover, who was really good at raising money from the federal government. In fact, Hoover figured out early and well that Hoover is a big part of this story, because Hoover leaves there's a beautiful book called Creating the Cold War University. It's about Stanford, based on Rebecca Lowen's PhD here, 1998, University of California Press, I think. So Herbert Hoover, great story, leaves the White House, comes here, very ambitious for Stanford and the region, wants government patronage of Stanford and the region, does not want government control. He's a Republican after all. So figures out the contract system, which essentially creates clear boundaries between what federal government money does and does not require of universities. So it's basically, very limited joint venture in which we take your money, and then the money stops flowing, and then you can't boss us around it anymore, right? The Hoover Institution essentially created mechanisms whereby federal investment could happen here, but also philanthropy. And a lot of big units on campuses are giant not departments. The Kennedy School of Government, right? It's like no political science department is big enough to encompass all of what, right? And so Harvard, creates another entity that has more intellectual and frankly patronage fluidity than a political science department could ever have. So these things can get very large and durable. Yeah. Yes.
My name is Shailen Banker.
Yes.
And I'm the editor, publisher for a global website.
Oh,
information knowledge website, and organized around 3 patents, a new way of organizing information that you can access very quickly and maybe do it in a fraction of the time that it takes now, maybe 20% of the time. All articles from major global websites in one place, going back 20 years. My question was, how can you be competitive in a global economy without, not necessarily global studies, you can call it anything, international, having a knowledge of what's happening around you in the world. And I made a couple of trips to Indian universities and elite institutions in India, the IIMs and IITs, Madras, Bombay, and talked to the deans and the IIM in Ahmedabad, which was a pioneer in setting up the Indian Institutes of Management under Nehru. That's one angle, you hear about international. They got to change to international, to internationalize the whole campus, set up the focus on international studies. And I am just invited Justin Trudeau to speak to students. In fact, they have a new organization. They took out some of the people and put new people in there to start. And some of them were educated in George Washington University, double degrees, graduate degrees. So they have that orientation back in India. Now, on the other hand, if you go to small towns, even in the south of India, or in the north, every city you go, every 50 miles, you're going to small villages, small towns, spiritual heritage, India, you have temples all over. And I was there, and I can tell you, every 2 miles, 3 miles, there's an international school. And the word international is used almost town to town, relate to it. It's like an advertising.
Yes.
We want to be international. We can, it's priced more. We want to be like, like we're knowledge about the world to kids. And education is just like exploding. That's like the private education is exploding. Now, so when you have this situation, I found that, this being competitive is what it's about. And I had this funny situation that I had when I went to a spiritual town in southern India, very famous, old 1,000 years old temples, in a mountain that's, it's circumambulate for spiritual life. There was a guy on a motorcyclist, and just came to the temple. I talked to him, and he said he's working for, in Madras, in Chennai, and he's here to this small town in South India, and he's going back. He works for an American company based here in California that's making mind-boggling energy equipment that's being put in a office complex of Intel Corporation in India and in Korea and here. And a Korean company is competing with him. So even from people from the villages, from towns, or working in Bangalore, working with companies here, competing with Korea, competing with the Korean company on the latest energy technology, which is some kind of solar technology that can pack in batteries. So I'm just saying, in this kind of a world, how can you be competitive without having students know about what's happening?
Okay. So
It's forgetting global status, forgetting the federal government. In India, it's the other way around. The University Grants Commission, get out of the business of private education. That's what the government is saying. We just want them to get out of it, so the students, universities can operate outside of government control.
here's one of the paradoxes of our business, I would say, our endeavor, if you don't want to use the word business, is we're obliged to be simultaneously cosmopolitan and parochial at the same time, right? The College of San Mateo is always going to be in San Mateo. It will never not be in San Mateo, right? So it always has to serve its clientele at the same time that it needs to connect its community with a larger world. And so I think that is an historical constant of the academic enterprise since its medieval inception. It has always been, we've always been servants of particular communities, and our job is to connect particular communities to the larger world, and to just essentially struggle with that conflict in ways that we, in different ways, in different contexts. I will say, I think one of what makes being here in this part of the world so interesting at this moment in history is that what may be a historical novelty is that the university has new potential competitors in knowledge production, distribution, and cohesion than it did not have in the past, right? The enormous data aggregators that are making trillions of dollars in this valley are creating mechanisms for producing, aggregating, and disseminating knowledge that have never existed before in world history. And so it's not clear to me what the relationship will be between universities like the one we are sitting in today and these new knowledge producers and aggregators. I think it's a thrilling problem, but I think we've actually never been here before historically. Yes?
I don't think I need a mic.
No.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Natasha Mancuso and I teach at Foothill College. My question is about online education.
Yes.
Where do you see that fit in? Does it help? Does it hurt? Take it away.
So one of the reasons this book took a long time to write was because something called massively open online courses it burst out of the computer science department at Stanford in 2012, for better or worse. Boy, did I pay attention to that, because I've been trying to figure out. I've been watching the changing financial infrastructure of U.S. higher education for some time, and then boom, MOOC mania happens. Let me tell you, that was computer science, president, provost, board of trustees. Like, no one got on the red phone to call the School of Education and ask for advice. Okay? And so I basically dropped everything that wasn't my family and gave myself, because when computer scientists decide they're doing something, they're doing it, right? And it was thrilling. Again, it was a thrilling time. And then what happened, but wait, then what happened is Harvard freaked out about this because this was Stanford going faster again. on the Achilles heel of Harvard, which is engineering and computer science. They feel really guilty about that. And they were offered an initial berth in Coursera alongside Stanford, Michigan, Princeton, and Penn, and that freaked him out too. So the president of Harvard got on the phone and called MIT, and in a matter of weeks created edX, the non-profit, not Stanford version of Coursera, right? Thus precipitating a tempest in a teapot. Like, you can't make this stuff up. This was classic Cambridge, Palo Alto frenemies competition stuff. And we all got sucked into it because when Harvard and Stanford do something, then everyone's doing it, right? At least instantaneously. Now, MOOCs obviously did not change the landscape of higher education. The landscape of higher education had been in secular change for some time. We did not invent online learning. That had been done across the state here, as many of you know, also by a bunch of entities, many but not all of them for-profit entities. But it's kind of, stirred the pot all the more. So what do I think of online learning? Well, I think that here to me is the hard fact. Physical co-presence is extremely costly, right? I mean, the opportunity costs that bring us all together on this lovely Saturday afternoon for 2 hours are really high. And we know that since Socrates, we know that physical co-presence in critical discourse is pedagogically very valuable. But we don't know how to dose it very well, right? So we've inherited a presumption in which some long period of contiguous time in physical co-presence is the best education. But we haven't really experimented with the sort of most, shall we say, cost and pedagogically effective mix of co-presence and distributed instruction. That to me is the hard fact. And for faculty at community colleges know better than anyone else. We can't expect people to reorganize their lives to be in our classrooms 4 to 6 hours a day. It's just simply unreasonable to do that. And so I think there's a broad recognition that if we want higher education to be accessible and frankly humane, we're going to have to create conditions under which college fits into people's lives rather than the other way around. I think digital media is unquestionably going to have to be a part of that, and it should be a part of that. It's obviously politically controversial because it essentially changes the fundamental labor relation between faculty and students. And obviously there are a lot of people who are primarily interested in making money off of the sort of least advantaged college hopefuls. So there's a lot of risk and uncertainty with moving education into its digital future. We have to do it. There's no way around it. I personally would be very eager to be of service to California community colleges in particular as they move into their digital future. Precisely because, let's face it, you're the linchpin of the master plan ambition. The future of the state is really up to you. I'm totally serious. You and the new versions of yourself that we might create together. We're not going to get another one of these things anytime soon. So that's what I think.
Anyone else? Okay.
Yeah.
I kind of have a question. I was
Yeah.
a student at Los Positas College, and I don't know too much about teaching and how it works, but I'm learning a lot today, so I'm happy to be here.
Right.
My question is, you were talking earlier about how Stanford and Harvard has a lot of influence on what other schools do.
Oh, man.
And and how everyone just kind of jumps the gun as soon as you guys put something out there. And I was thinking, there's all of this talk about how global studies kind of has to come from the bottom up, but what is there being done to collaborate between the top and the bottom to create a more, a better global studies class? Like, what kind of plan is there to implement it? Because I feel like in order for it to be successful, it has to come from the top and the bottom and kind of just meet in the middle. And it can't just be from like the bottom up. And not that it couldn't be, but I think it would be easier if you guys kind of rallied behind the bottom and kind of showed support.
Okay, this is a great place to conclude. So this is a really good place to conclude. The academic, there's a peculiar feature, a core feature of the academic status system in the United States is that it's one status system, okay? It's one pyramid, right? There's Harvard and Stanford and 6 other schools that are global singularities that can probably never be replicated at the top. And then there's everybody else who compares themselves in one way or another, to that single hierarchy. And it's tragic because we have 5,000 institutions of learning in this country and we have one prestige system. I mean, it's not cool, right? In terms of status politics. What was cool about it for much of the 20th century was that during this Cold War period that I spent the time emphasizing today, it enabled us all to believe that we were part of a single academy. And what was good for the research universities was good for the community colleges, was good for the comprehensive universities, and we could all imagine ourselves as part of the same academic community. And we all got Title IV money. We still do. You get Pell, we get Pell, right? So with the idea of a unified academic community, I think, has been very valuable for American higher education in the 20th century. It is highly at risk because the fate of schools like mine are increasingly not connected to the fate of schools like yours. And schools like mine are increasingly acting what I call essentially like private states. They're becoming entities for themselves, for their own purposes. And I think the demise of that notion of a national academic community would be a very tragic thing. But I think it's up to us to come up with mechanisms for cross-institutional collaboration that will enable the kind of future you're talking about. And here's what I'm hoping for as a citizen of Stanford, right? And I'll conclude here, I promise. Like, during the relatively recent decades that Stanford was becoming a great university, it didn't have to think about the education of the people of California. Because California was building the largest, most well-funded, and most accessible public higher education system in world history. All right? So we didn't have to think about the state. But the next 25 years are quite different, right? Stanford cannot presume that the public commitment to higher education in California is going to be sufficient to sustain the economic and civic vitality of the region. And so I think it provides fresh opportunity for us to offer new opportunities to the friends of our institutions to collaborate with one another in new kinds of joint ventures. But if we don't do that, the notion that we might be a shared academic community, I think, is uncertain. So let's keep it up, right?